I don't think that's necessary. Then I'll make one call. Freeze the $500 million deal.
Wait, what?
Its CEO snubbed black investors' handshake. One call froze a $500 M deal. The conference room on the 23rd floor had been designed to make people feel smaller. Glass walls stretched from ceiling to floor. A city of steel and concrete moved below them, while executives sat around a polished walnut table discussing a $500 million expansion that could redefine the future of Meridian Biosystems. Marcus Ellison had spent 12 years learning what rooms like this measured. Not intelligence. Not preparation, not character. Sometimes they measured whether someone looked like the person others expected to see holding the final approval. At 46, Marcus had built Northbridge Capital from a small investment firm into a respected private equity group known for rebuilding companies instead of stripping them down. He wore a charcoal suit without a flashy watch. He carried a leather portfolio marked with handwritten notes, and arrived 20 minutes early because he believed details revealed more than speeches. He was not there to impress anyone. He was there because Meridian needed a partner. Across the table, CEO Richard Whitmore reviewed the final pages of the proposal without looking up. Meridian's expansion plan depended on Northbridge's $500 million investment, a partnership that would create thousands of jobs across 3 states and fund a new manufacturing facility. Marcus extended his hand. Richard, I appreciate the opportunity to work through this together. For a moment, the room held still. Whitmore looked at Marcus's hand. Then he looked back at the documents. I think we should let the legal teams handle the formalities, he said. And his hand never moved. It was a small moment, less than 3 seconds, no raised voice, no obvious insult. Nothing anyone could point to in a meeting summary. But Marcus noticed. So did the 2 people sitting closest to him. Elena Park, Meridian's chief operations officer, glanced down at her notes. She had spent 6 months working with Marcus's team and knew he had personally reviewed every manufacturing projection in the proposal. Daniel Brooks, Northbridge's senior analyst, shifted slightly in his chair. Marcus slowly lowered his hand. Of course, he said. He returned to his seat. The meeting continued. Whitmore talked about cultural alignment. He talked about protecting Meridian's reputation. He talked about choosing partners who understood the company's history. Marcus listened carefully, because experience had taught him that people often revealed their concerns by the words they avoided. Nobody questioned Northbridge's financial capacity. Nobody challenged the projections. Nobody disputed the due diligence. Instead, the conversation kept circling around whether Marcus and his team were the right fit. After the meeting, Marcus walked through the quiet hallway outside the conference room while executives exchanged polite goodbyes behind him. Daniel caught up. That was strange, Daniel said. Marcus stopped near the elevator. What was? Daniel hesitated. A handshake. Marcus looked at the numbers displayed above the elevator doors. Small things are usually only small when nobody is paying attention. Daniel lowered his voice. Are you going to confront him? Marcus shook his head. No, the elevator arrived. Not yet. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table reviewing the meeting notes while rain tapped against the windows of his home in Atlanta. His wife, Naomi, noticed the unopened dinner plate beside him. You're doing that thing again, she said. Marcus looked up. What thing? Trying to solve a problem before admitting it bothered you. He smiled slightly. Naomi had known him long enough to recognize when silence meant focus and when it meant disappointment. It wasn't about the handshake, Marcus said. I know. It was about what happened before and after. She waited. Before I walked in, everyone knew my firm had the capital. After I sat down, they still needed to decide if they trusted the person attached to it. Marcus opened the meeting file again. There was one detail he could not ignore. 3 weeks earlier, Meridian's board had approved Northbridge as the preferred investment partner after a competitive review. The final agreement was scheduled for signature within days, but during the meeting, Whitmore had asked for additional time. No reason. No documentation. Just hesitation. Marcus opened a secure message from his legal advisor. A new note had arrived. Subject: Meridian Investment Review Concern. The message contained a request from one of Northbridge's compliance partners. A question had surfaced about whether Meridian had changed the evaluation process after selecting Northbridge. Marcus read the sentence twice. Someone else had noticed. And now the issue was no longer about a missed handshake. It was about whether a $500 million decision had been changed after the winner was already chosen. Marcus closed the laptop. He did not make a call that night. He knew the difference between reacting and responding. But before sunrise, he would have to decide whether to protect the deal, challenge the process, or walk away from a company that had already shown him how it saw him. Part 2. The Wrong Story Gans Authority. By 7:15 the next morning, Richard Whitmore had already told his version of the story. It happened in a smaller conference room on Meridian Biosystems' executive floor, behind a door that required a security badge and a reason to enter. The people inside were not discussing the handshake. They were discussing concerns. That was the word Whitmore preferred. Concerns, not doubts. Not assumptions, not discomfort. Concern sounded responsible. We need to make sure we are not rushing into a partnership of this size, Whitmore said, placing a folder on the table. $500 million changes the direction of this company for decades. The board members around him nodded. Nobody disagreed with that statement. That was what made the conversation effective. Whitmore was not arguing against the investment. He was presenting himself as the person protecting Meridian from risk. "You have to ask whether Northbridge understands our operational culture," he continued. "Capital is important, but alignment matters." Elena Park sat at the far end of the table. She listened carefully, because she knew something most of the room did not. Marcus Ellison had spent more time inside Meridian's facilities than some Meridian executives. He had visited the aging manufacturing plant in Ohio. He had spoken with engineers during night shifts. He had reviewed supply chain delays that had never appeared in the polished presentations prepared for investors. He knew the company beyond spreadsheets. But that was not the story being created. The story being created was simpler. A cautious CEO was protecting a legacy company from an outside investor who might not understand what Meridian needed. Elena looked at the folder in front of her. Inside was a revised partnership review request. EU committee, additional interviews, another cultural assessment. She looked up. Was this process applied to the other firms? Hume became quieter. Whitmore folded his hands. The other firms did not advance as far. That wasn't my question. A few people looked away. Whitmore remained calm. We are discussing Northbridge because Northbridge is the firm we are considering. Elena understood the answer. It was not an answer. Across town, Marcus was already on his second call. His attorney, Claire Bennett, had joined him from her office in Chicago. "Walk me through exactly what happened after the meeting," she said. Marcus looked through his notes. Nothing official happened until this morning, but they changed the process. Did they terminate negotiations? No. Did they reject the investment? No. Did they violate a signed agreement? Not yet. Claire paused. That word matters. Marcus knew what she meant. Not yet. The challenge was not proving someone disliked him. The challenge was proving whether that dislike influenced a business decision. Intent was difficult. Patterns were easier. "Marcus," Claire said, "do you still want this deal?" He looked out the window of his office. Below him, employees moved between buildings, carrying coffee, opening laptops, starting ordinary days. A $500 million agreement was being treated like a transaction. But to thousands of workers, it was not just a transaction. It was jobs, communities, families. "I want the deal if Meridian wants the partnership," he said. "And if they don't, then I want the truth." That afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected message. It came from Daniel Brooks. "I found something you should see." Attached was a document from Meridian's internal investor evaluation system. Daniel had worked with Northbridge's compliance team for years. His job was not to search for wrongdoing. His job was to understand decisions, and decisions left trails. The document showed the original ranking of the investment proposals. Northbridge had scored first in every measurable category. Capital strength, operational experience, long-term commitment, manufacturing expertise. The second-ranked firm was behind in nearly every category. But beneath the final ranking was a note added 2 days after the selection committee's recommendation. Additional review required regarding external stakeholder perception and executive compatibility. Marcus read the line twice, executive compatibility, a phrase that could mean anything, which was exactly why it mattered. "Who added this?" Marcus asked. Daniel answered almost immediately. "I'm still checking." Marcus leaned back. The document was not enough, not yet. It did not prove discrimination. It did not prove intent. But it showed something important. The rules had changed after the decision was made, and someone had decided the person attached to the investment needed another test. Later that evening, Marcus met Elena at a quiet coffee shop outside downtown. She arrived 10 minutes late and apologized before sitting down. "I wasn't sure I should come." Marcus nodded. "I understand." Elena looked uncomfortable. "You should know something. Richard is not telling the board the whole story." "What is he telling them?" "That you are unfamiliar with Meridian." Marcus almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was strange. "I spent 6 months reviewing their operations." "I know. You know?" Elena looked down. "I was the one who gave your team access to the facilities." The two sat silently for a moment. Then Elena said something that changed the direction of the entire dispute. The handshake was not the first time. Marcus looked at her. "Do you mean?" She opened her phone. "I noticed it during the executive dinner last month." A photo appeared on the screen. Not a dramatic image. Not a perfect piece of evidence. Just a seating chart from the dinner event. Marcus recognized the names. Board members, executives, investors. But one detail stood out. His name had been moved from the primary investor table to a secondary discussion table 30 minutes before the event began. "Who changed this?" Marcus asked. Elena shook her head. "I don't know." Marcus looked again. The issue was becoming clearer. The handshake was not the story. It was one moment inside a pattern, and patterns were harder to dismiss. The next morning, Meridian's board would receive a message from Marcus Ellison. Not a threat, not an accusation. A request. For the first time, the company would have to decide whether it wanted to investigate what happened, or explain why it refused to. Part 3. The reversible line Marcus sent the message at 8:02 a.m. not to Richard Whitmore, to the executive team, to the Meridian board chair. The subject line was simple: request for independent review of investment evaluation process. The body was only 3 paragraphs. Marcus did not accuse anyone of discrimination. He did not mention the handshake. He did not describe the uncomfortable moments that had accumulated over weeks. Instead, he asked for something harder to ignore: a review of whether the evaluation process had changed after Northbridge Capital had already been selected as the preferred partner. He attached 3 documents: the original investment ranking, the revised review request, and the communication showing that additional scrutiny had been introduced after the decision. At the bottom, he wrote one sentence: "Northbridge remains committed to the partnership, but we cannot participate in a process where the standard changes after the outcome is known." Then he pressed send. For several minutes, nothing happened. Marcus had learned years ago that important messages rarely produced immediate results. People needed time to decide whether they were facing a problem or an opportunity. At Meridian headquarters, Richard Whitmore received the email before most board members had opened it. His assistant printed a copy. He read it standing beside his desk. The first thing he noticed was what Marcus had not done. He had not threatened legal action. He had not contacted the media. He had not publicly accused Meridian. That bothered Richard more than anger would have. Anger could be dismissed. Calm required a response. He called his general counsel. "We need to handle this carefully," Richard said. The attorney looked at the email. "Did Marcus raise a formal complaint?" "No." "Did he make an allegation?" "Directly." "Then what exactly is the issue?" Richard looked toward the window. The city moved below him. "The issue is that he is forcing us to explain the process." The attorney studied him. "And can we?" Richard did not answer. That afternoon, the board held an emergency discussion. Not a meeting. The difference mattered. A meeting created minutes. A discussion created flexibility. Elena Park attended remotely. As executives carefully avoided certain words, no one said bias, no one said discrimination. Instead, they used phrases like perception risk and stakeholder confidence. Elena had spent 15 years in corporate environments. She understood how language worked. Sometimes people changed the vocabulary because they were changing the meaning. "The Investor Review Committee followed appropriate procedures," Richard said. Elena looked at the timeline on her screen. "Which procedures?" The question surprised him. "What do you mean? The original selection process or the additional review process?" Nobody answered immediately. Richard leaned forward. "Additional review was necessary because this is a significant partnership." Elena nodded slowly. "Then why was it not applied before the selection?" Again, silence. The problem was not that Richard had no explanation. The problem was that every explanation created another question. Meanwhile, Marcus faced pressure from his own team. Northbridge's partners were divided. Some wanted to walk away. One partner, James Holloway, believed Meridian had already shown enough. "We do not need them," James said during the internal meeting. Marcus listened. James had been with Northbridge since the beginning. He had helped build the firm when they had fewer employees than conference rooms. "They disrespect us once," James continued. "We will do it again." Marcus understood the anger. Part of him felt it too. But he also knew $500 million was not just about pride. "We have to separate the company from the people creating the problem," Marcus said. James leaned back. "And if the company refuses to separate itself?" Marcus looked around the room. "Then we leave." The answer was not dramatic. It was practical. A partnership required two parties choosing each other, not one side proving they deserved to be there. That evening, Daniel discovered something important. The seating chart from the executive dinner was not the only change. He found the original event plan. Marcus's table assignment had been changed by a member of Meridian's communications department. The reason listed, executive guest balance adjustment. Daniel stared at the phrase. It looked harmless, almost impossible to challenge. But when he compared it with the other changes, a pattern appeared. Each individual decision had a reasonable explanation. Together, they told a different story. He called Marcus. He found another piece. Marcus answered from his office. "What is it?" "The dinner seating change." "I know about that." "There's more." Daniel sent the file. Marcus opened it. The original seating plan showed something unexpected. Marcus was not simply assigned a different seat. The person moved into his place was an executive from another investment group, a firm that had originally lost the Meridian deal. Marcus read the name. Then he looked at the timeline. That firm's representative had contacted Richard Whitmore the morning after the dinner. 3 days later, the additional review process began. Marcus closed his eyes. The situation had changed, not because he had found proof of everything. He had not. But because the question was no longer only whether Meridian judged him differently. The question was whether someone had influenced the process after the decision was already made. And that question could not be answered with a handshake. It required records. It required people. It required a process Meridian could not control completely. The next morning, Marcus received a letter from Meridian. The board had agreed to conduct an internal review, but there was one sentence near the end that caught his attention. "Until the review is completed, all partnership discussions will be paused." The deal was frozen. Not canceled, not rejected, frozen. $500 million was now sitting still. And for the first time, everyone involved understood the same thing. The handshake had never been the main issue. It had only been the first visible crack. Part 4. Counterforce and personal cost. The freeze lasted 9 days. To the outside world, 9 days did not sound like much. No headlines, no public announcement, no dramatic collapse. But inside Meridian Biosystems, those 9 days changed the temperature of every conversation. A $500 million investment that had been expected to move into final documentation was suddenly sitting untouched. Employees noticed, suppliers noticed, board members noticed, and Richard Whitmore noticed that silence could create more questions than answers. He spent most of the week repeating the same message. The review process demonstrates Meridian's commitment to transparency. It was the kind of sentence that sounded reassuring when repeated enough times. But Marcus noticed something different. Nobody was saying the review was unnecessary. Nobody was saying the process had been clean. They were only saying Meridian was looking into it. That distinction mattered, because an investigation could either be a search for truth or a carefully managed delay. Marcus needed to know which one he was facing. On the 5th day of the freeze, Claire Bennett called him. "I received Meridian's response to the document request," she said. Marcus was sitting in his office surrounded by financial reports and manufacturing projections. "What did they provide?" "Some of it. And the rest?" He said, "Certain internal communications are protected by executive privilege." Marcus looked up. Executive privilege? Not exactly legal privilege. More of a corporate confidentiality argument. He understood. They were not refusing everything. They were creating boundaries. "What are they withholding?" "Messages related to the additional review process." Marcus leaned back. The same process that had appeared after Northbridge was selected. The same process that paused the deal. The same process that Meridian now claimed was necessary. Can they do that? They can request it, Claire said. Whether it is reasonable depends on what happens next. Marcus looked through the window of his office. A construction crew worked on a building across the street. Workers moved through the morning without knowing that a decision made in this room could affect thousands of people. What would you do? He asked. Claire paused. It was not a legal question, it was a personal one. I would ask what outcome you want. Marcus was quiet, because he knew the answer. He wanted Meridian to acknowledge what happened, not because he needed an apology. Because organizations repeated what they refused to examine. That night, Marcus drove to his mother's house outside Atlanta. He had not planned to go. He simply found himself turning onto the familiar street after work. His mother, Evelyn, opened the door before he knocked. Tired, she said. Marcus smiled. That obvious? You have the same face you had when you were 12 and tried to fix the broken fence by yourself. He laughed. I fixed it. You made it lean in the opposite direction. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. For a few minutes, they talked about ordinary things, the neighbor's garden, a family friend's retirement, a recipe Evelyn wanted to try. Marcus needed that, a reminder that his life was larger than boardrooms and negotiations. Eventually, his mother asked the question she had been waiting to ask. Did they make you prove yourself again? Marcus looked down. He did not answer immediately. His mother had watched him experience those moments before. Not always obvious. Not always dramatic. Sometimes they came disguised as questions. Are you sure you're qualified? Are you really the decision-maker? Are you the person we expected? Marcus had spent years building a career where his work spoke before he entered a room, but sometimes people still needed to understand who they were seeing. It's complicated, he said. Evelyn nodded. Most unfair things are. He looked at her. What do you mean? The easy ones are obvious. The hard ones are the ones where someone can explain every single thing they did. The sentence stayed with him, because that was exactly what made Meridian difficult. Every moment had a possible excuse. The handshake, the seating change, the additional review. Approval. Any one of them could be dismissed. Together, they demanded attention. The next morning, Elena Park requested a private meeting with Marcus. This time, she did not choose a public location. She invited him to a conference room at an independent business center away from Meridian's offices. When Marcus arrived, Elena already had documents waiting. I found something, she said. Marcus sat down. What? Elena opened a report. It's from the original investment committee. The report showed the final recommendation before Richard requested additional review. Northbridge had been approved. But there was another detail. A handwritten note appeared beside the recommendation. Marcus read it carefully. Strongest operational partner. Potential executive relationship concern. He looked up. This. Elena shook her head. That's the problem. The note had no author, no timestamp, no digital signature. Someone had added it after the committee recommendation, and someone had made sure it would be difficult to trace. Marcus studied the document. This changes things. Elena nodded. Yes, but not enough. She looked surprised. He continued. It shows someone influenced the process. It does not show who or why. Elena leaned back. That is exactly why I was afraid to bring this forward. Marcus looked at her. Because you thought I would use it as proof? No. She looked at the document. Because I thought you would be disappointed that it wasn't enough. Marcus understood. She was right. Part of him wanted a single answer, a name, a message, a moment where someone admitted what they had done. Investigations rarely worked that way. The truth was usually buried beneath ordinary choices. A changed seat, a different phrase, an unexplained delay. A decision that looked harmless until the pattern became visible. That evening, Meridian released a statement internally. The review would continue. But before it ended, Richard Whitmore made one decision. He removed Elena Park from the review committee. The official reason was simple. Potential conflict due to previous involvement with the investment process. Marcus read the message twice. Elena had helped uncover concerns. Now she was being separated from the process examining them. The review had not just become about what happened before. It had become about what Meridian would do after someone tried to find out. Marcus closed his laptop. The next step would not be about winning a negotiation. It would be about protecting the investigation itself. because if the process could be controlled, the truth could disappear inside it. Part 5. The reversal, or deeper problem. The first person to understand that Meridian's internal review had changed direction was not Marcus. It was Elena. She noticed it in the language. A week earlier, the review team had been focused on one question: did the investment evaluation process change after Northbridge was selected? Now the questions had shifted. They were asking, who had access to the documents? Who communicated with outside investors? Who approved changes to executive schedules? The difference was subtle, but it revealed something important. The review was no longer examining only the decision. It was examining the environment around the decision. And that meant someone inside Meridian had realized the problem might be larger than one executive's judgment. Elena sat alone in her apartment that evening, reviewing every email she had saved. She had spent 14 years building her career at Meridian. She had entered the company as a process engineer before moving into operations leadership. She knew the manufacturing floors, the supply chain issues, the people who kept the company running when executives were focused on quarterly presentations. She had always believed organizations could correct themselves. But now she wondered whether she had confused the ability to change with the willingness to change. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Elena smiled faintly. "He called to ask me that?" "Yes. Most people would call because they need something." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That is exactly why I called." Elena looked out her window. "You know they are going to say I became involved." "I know. And they will say I compromised the review." "I know." She waited. "What do you think?" Marcus answered honestly. "I think they are using a real concern to avoid a harder one." Elena closed her eyes. That was the sentence she had been unable to form, not because it was complicated, because it was simple. Organizations rarely defended bad decisions directly. They defended the process around them. The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected invitation, not from Richard Whitmore, from the chair of Meridian's audit committee. The meeting was scheduled for 45 minutes. No executives. No team. Just Marcus, Claire, and 3 members of the audit committee. When Marcus entered the room, he noticed something immediately. There were printed documents on the table. Not presentations. Documents. That meant the conversation had moved beyond reputation management. Someone was looking at facts. The committee chair, Samuel Grant, opened the meeting. "Mr. Ellison, we want to clarify something." Marcus waited. The board did not authorize changes to the investor selection process after the recommendation. Marcus looked at Claire, then back at Samuel. "Are you saying the additional review was unauthorized?" Samuel chose his words carefully. "We are saying we are investigating why it was initiated." That answer mattered, because it was the first time someone inside Meridian had admitted that the review itself required review. He placed a document on the table. This request was added 48 hours after Northbridge was recommended. Samuel nodded. "We are aware." "Who approved it?" Samuel looked at the other committee members. "That is what we are determining." Marcus leaned forward. "I want to be clear. Northbridge is not asking Meridian to choose us because we raised concerns." Nobody interrupted. "We are asking Meridian to determine whether the same standards were applied to everyone involved." Samuel nodded. "That is a reasonable request." It was the first time Marcus heard someone at Meridian use the word reasonable. Not difficult, not aggressive, not emotional, reasonable. But before the meeting ended, Samuel revealed something Marcus did not expect. "Is another issue." Marcus waited. The second-ranked investment firm contacted Meridian after the original selection. Marcus looked at him. "When?" "The day after the executive dinner." The room became still. "About what?" Samuel opened a file. They expressed concern that Northbridge's leadership team might create reputational challenges for Meridian. Marcus read the attached message. The wording was careful, professional, almost polite. It did not mention race. It did not mention Marcus being black. It mentioned perception, public confidence, market reaction, leadership image. The language was different. The pattern was familiar. Someone had taken a personal judgment and translated it into corporate risk. Marcus placed the paper down. "Did Meridian ask for this opinion?" Samuel hesitated. That hesitation answered before his words did. No, the review continued. And within 48 hours, investigators found the first major contradiction. The executive compatibility concern had been added to Marcus's evaluation file after the competing firm raised objections. But the person who added the concern was not Richard Whitmore. It was a senior strategy executive who reported directly to him. The executive claimed the note was based on market feedback, but nobody could identify the source. No survey, no client concern, no investor complaint, no operational risk, just a phrase. Executive compatibility. A phrase that had influenced a $500 million decision. A phrase that had no measurable definition. That afternoon, Richard Whitmore released a statement to senior leadership. He denied any improper conduct. He said the company had acted out of caution and responsibility. He said Meridian welcomed a thorough review. But one sentence created a new problem. Meridian has always valued partners who reflect the company's leadership expectations and culture. Marcus read the statement twice. Because now the issue was no longer hidden. The question was no longer whether someone felt uncomfortable with him. The question was whether an organization had built a system where that discomfort could become a business standard. And for the first time, Marcus saw the real challenge. The handshake had not been the barrier. The barrier was the permission structure around it. Part 6, the second. Problem. In motion. The problem with a corporate review was that everyone wanted the truth to arrive in a form they could manage. A clean timeline, a single mistake. One person responsible. One apology. One announcement. But the deeper Marcus looked into Meridian's evaluation process, the more he realized the situation had never been built around one decision. It had been built around a series of small permissions. Who was allowed to question? Who was expected to explain? Who received the benefit of uncertainty? And who had to prove they belonged before anyone considered the possibility that they already did. 3 days after the audit committee meeting, Marcus received a call from Samuel Grant. The audit chair sounded different than before. He's formal, more tired. "We found something you should know," Samuel said. Marcus sat forward. "What did you find?" He reviewed communication between Meridian executives and the competing investment firm. And Samuel paused. The communication did not violate any specific contract. Marcus waited. But it raises concerns about influence. That word mattered, influence. Not ownership. Not control. Not wrongdoing yet. What kind of influence? Marcus asked. Samuel explained that after Northbridge had been selected, several Meridian executives began discussing whether the partnership would send the right message to the market. The conversation was not about financial performance. Not about operational capability, not about long-term strategy. It was about perception. Marcus looked down at his notes. Did anyone ask whether we could deliver the expansion plan? Yes. And was there a concern? No. The answer came quickly. That told Marcus everything. The issue had never been competence. It had been comfort. But Samuel added something unexpected. The review team also found a problem with Northbridge's own process. Marcus raised an eyebrow. My process? Yes. The honesty caught him off guard. Problem. One of your early reports recommended a faster approval timeline. Marcus frowned. I rejected that recommendation. Exactly. Samuel continued. The report was based on projected market conditions. You slowed the process because you wanted more operational verification. Marcus remembered. 3 months earlier, his team had pushed to finalize the Meridian deal quickly because interest rates were changing and competitors were entering the market. He had disagreed. He wanted to visit the manufacturing facilities. He wanted employee feedback. He wanted to understand what the company needed beyond financial rescue. It had cost him time. It had frustrated some partners, but it was the right decision, Samuel continued. The reason I mention this is because it confirms something important. What? You were being evaluated on a standard you were not even using on yourself. Marcus stayed silent, because he understood the point. He had been willing to question his own assumptions. Meridian had questioned his identity before questioning his plan. That difference mattered. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with Daniel and Claire. They sat in a small conference room at Northbridge's office. No glass walls. No polished executive table. Just 3 people reviewing documents. Claire placed a folder down. We have enough to make a public accusation. Marcus looked at her. And should we? No. The answer surprised Daniel. Claire continued. Because the strongest case is not that one person disliked you. She tapped the folder. The strongest case is that the process allowed undefined concerns to outweigh measurable qualifications. Marcus nodded slowly. That was the difference. A personal argument could become a debate. A process failure could be examined. Daniel opened another file. There is something else. Inside was an internal Meridian communication from the strategy department. A meeting summary. One sentence had been highlighted. Investor confidence depends on selecting leadership partners who fit Meridian's traditional image. Marcus stared at the words. Traditional image. Another phrase without a clear definition. What does that mean? Daniel asked. Nobody answered, because that was the problem. The phrase could mean experience. It could mean communication style. It could mean industry background. Or it could become a container for every unconscious assumption people refuse to examine. Marcus closed the file. We need to be careful. Daniel looked confused. Careful. Yes. Marcus pointed to the document. If we turn this into a fight about one person's intentions, they will spend all their energy defending intentions. He looked at both of them. The question is not what someone believed privately. Claire nodded. The question is what the system allowed them to do publicly. That evening, Marcus received another message. This time from Richard Whitmore. A private request, a meeting. No lawyers, no board members, just the two of them. Marcus almost declined. Part of him believed the conversation should have happened weeks earlier, before the handshake, before the review, before $500 million became a question mark. But another part of him knew something important. If Richard was finally willing to speak without a room full of people protecting him, Marcus needed to hear what he had to say. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. When Marcus arrived, Richard was already there. He looked different. Not defeated, not angry, just less certain. I know you probably think this meeting is overdue, Richard said. Marcus sat down. It is. Richard accepted the answer. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Richard said something Marcus did not expect. I should have shaken your hand. Marcus looked at him. It was the first direct acknowledgement anyone from Meridian had made. But Marcus did not respond immediately, because an apology for the moment was not the same as accountability for the process. Richard continued. Did a judgment too quickly? Marcus nodded. But, Richard looked down, but I'm not sure I was the only one. The sentence changed the room. Because for the first time, Richard was not defending Meridian. He was admitting something larger. Someone else had shaped the decision. Someone else had created the standard. Marcus leaned forward. Then help me understand who. Richard looked toward the window, and after a long silence, he answered. There is someone on the board who believed your partnership would create problems before they ever met you. Marcus felt the direction of the conversation shift, not toward a person, toward a system. The next step would not be about proving one executive was wrong. It would be about discovering how a belief became a business decision. Part 7. The Collision and Accountability Test. Marcus arrived at Meridian's headquarters 3 days later, but this time he did not enter through the executive entrance. He entered through the main lobby. It was a small choice, one that most people would not notice, but Marcus had spent enough years in corporate environments to understand that buildings told stories. Executive entrances separated decision-makers from the people affected by those decisions. Today, he wanted to see the company as it actually operated, not as it appeared in presentations. The audit committee had scheduled a formal accountability session, not a negotiation. Not a partnership discussion. A review. Inside the room were the audit committee members, Richard Whitmore, Meridian's general counsel, Elena Park, and 2 independent reviewers brought in to examine the processes. For the first time since the investment dispute began, everyone responsible for answering questions was in the same room. Samuel Grant opened the meeting. We are not here to determine whether one person felt uncomfortable with another person. He looked around the table. We are here to determine whether that discomfort influenced a business process. The statement changed the atmosphere because it moved the conversation away from feelings toward decisions. The first document displayed was the original investment ranking. Northbridge Capital, first place. The numbers were clear. Financial strength, operational experience, long-term commitment, risk assessment. All categories favored Marcus's firm. The second showed the additional review request. Added 48 hours after approval. A new standard, a new question, executive compatibility. One of the independent reviewers turned toward Richard. Can you explain how this term was defined? Richard looked at the document. We wanted to ensure alignment between leadership teams. That is not a definition. Stayed quiet. Richard adjusted his posture. It referred to communication style, strategic approach, and organizational expectations. The reviewer nodded. Were those criteria measured for the other investment firms? Richard did not answer. The silence was enough, the reviewer continued. Were they added before or after Northbridge was selected? After. And were they added before or after the competing firm contacted Meridian? Richard looked down. That question had been expected. But expectation did not make it easier. After. Marcus watched carefully. Because this was the moment where organizations often made a choice. They either examined the uncomfortable facts, or they protected the people connected to them. Samuel placed another document on the screen. An email chain. The sender was a Meridian board member. The recipient was Richard Whitmore. The subject line, Investor Fit Concerns. The first message was dated 2 days before the additional review request. The board member had written, I'm not convinced this partnership represents the direction our company should be associated with. The reviewer asked, was this concern based on financial analysis? Richard answered quietly, no. Operational performance? No. Legal risk? No. The reviewer looked at the screen. Then what was it based on? Nobody spoke. The answer existed in the room, but nobody wanted to say it first. Marcus finally spoke. What concerns me is not that someone had an opinion. Everyone looked toward him. People have opinions every day. He paused. What concerns me is that the opinion became a reason to create a new standard after the decision had already been made. His voice remained calm. No speech. Performance. Just a fact. The reviewer nodded. That is the central issue. Then Elena spoke. Her voice was quieter. But there is another issue. She looked at the documents. The people who raised concerns about the process were treated as risks. Richard looked at her. No, she said, not loudly but firmly. I spent 14 years here. I know how this works. She pointed to the review timeline. When Marcus questioned the process, he became difficult. She pointed to herself. When I questioned the process, I became conflicted. She looked around the room. That is the pattern. Nobody responded. Because the evidence was no longer about one investor. It was about how disagreement was handled. The independent reviewers presented their preliminary findings. They did not use dramatic language. They did not make accusations. They identified failures. The evaluation criteria had changed after selection. The new criteria were not applied consistently. The additional review was initiated without proper documentation, and senior leadership had allowed subjective concerns to influence a decision involving hundreds of millions of dollars. But then came the question everyone had been avoiding. What happens now? The audit committee discussed possible actions. A temporary suspension of the partnership process, a governance review, a revised investor evaluation framework, an external compliance assessment. Marcus listened. Just one point. I want something clear. Samuel looked at him. What? I do not want this resolved by removing one person and pretending the system fixed itself. William became still. Marcus continued. If someone loses their position, that may be necessary. But it cannot be the only result. He looked at the documents. The process allowed this to happen. That sentence mattered, because it prevented the easiest ending. One person blamed, everyone else unchanged. The audit committee voted that afternoon. The partnership review would remain paused. The existing evaluation process would be suspended. An independent governance assessment would begin immediately. Richard Whitmore would remain CEO during the review, but his authority over the investment decision was removed. The result was not a victory. Not yet. The deal was still frozen. The company was still under pressure. And Marcus still had no guarantee that Northbridge would invest. As he left Meridian's headquarters, Elena walked beside him. You know, she said, most people would have taken the win. Marcus looked at her. What win? At the moment where everyone admits they were wrong. He shook his head. That is not enough. Elena studied him. What would be enough? Marcus looked back at the building. Making sure the next person does not have to survive the same process. For the first time, the dispute was no longer about whether Marcus Ellison belonged at Meridian. The question had become whether Meridian could become the kind of company that recognized value before asking someone to prove they deserved a seat. But the review had uncovered one more problem. The $500 million partnership was still frozen, And now the board had to decide whether fixing the process was worth risking the future they had originally planned. Part 8. The decision and its cost. The hardest decisions inside organizations were rarely the ones that created the most noise. They were the ones made after everyone understood what happened. Because once the facts became clear, there was no longer confusion to hide behind. There was responsibility. 3 weeks after the accountability session, Meridian's audit committee completed its review. The announcement was sent internally at 6:30 a.m. Employees opened the message before arriving at work. Investors read it before market analysts could comment. And Marcus received a copy at the same moment as the rest of the Northbridge leadership team. The first paragraph was carefully written. Meridian acknowledged that the investor evaluation process had been altered after the original selection recommendation. The additional review criteria had not been applied consistently. Certain leadership concerns had influenced the process without being connected to measurable business requirements. The company committed to restructuring how future strategic partnerships would be evaluated. Marcus read the message twice, not because he was surprised, because he knew how much effort it took for an organization to put those words in writing. Companies apologized for outcomes. They rarely acknowledged systems. But the next section mattered more: the consequences. Richard Whitmore would remain CEO. However, the board removed him from all decisions related to the Northbridge partnership and placed him under a formal leadership review. The strategy executive who added the executive compatibility note resigned before the review concluded. The board member who raised concerns about Marcus's leadership image stepped away from the investment committee. The independent assessment found no evidence of a coordinated effort to harm Northbridge. But it found something almost as important: a culture where undefined concerns could influence major decisions without sufficient challenge. That was the part Marcus focused on. Not the resignations, not the headlines, the culture. Later that morning, Marcus met with his Northbridge team. The room was quieter than usual. Everyone expected him to announce the obvious, that they were walking away. James Holloway, who had wanted to leave weeks earlier, looked at him. So? Marcus placed the Meridian report on the table. We have a choice. James crossed his arms. Which is, we can end the partnership. We looked surprised. Or we can move forward under new conditions. Claire opened the report. You already know what those conditions are. Marcus nodded. Independent oversight, transparent evaluation standards, protection for employees who raise concerns, clear documentation requirements, informal review criteria. James looked frustrated. Marcus, they almost lost us $500 million. Yes, they embarrassed you. Yes. They only changed after they were forced to. Marcus looked around the room. That is true. The honesty caught everyone's attention. Isidore, he continued. But the question is not whether Meridian made mistakes. He tapped the report. We already know that. The question is whether the company is willing to change after those mistakes are exposed. That afternoon, Marcus met with Richard Whitmore for the final time before the partnership decision. The meeting took place in a smaller room than their first one. No presentation screens, no executives, just two people. Richard looked older. Not dramatically, just like someone who had spent weeks realizing that confidence and certainty were not the same thing. I owe you a better apology, Richard said. Marcus waited. Richard continued. The handshake was wrong. Marcus nodded. Yes, I should have treated you as the partner you already were. Marcus looked at him. That was part of it. Richard understood. The process, yes. For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then he asked, Do you believe I knew exactly what was happening? Marcus considered the question. The easy answer would have been yes. The satisfying answer would have been yes. But Marcus had spent weeks fighting against assumptions. I believe you created an environment where certain assumptions were allowed to influence decisions. Richard looked down. That is harder to hear. It should be. The answer was not cruel. It was honest. Richard nodded. I understand. The partnership decision was made 5 days later. Northbridge agreed to proceed, but not under the original terms. The revised agreement included a governance framework that required independent oversight of major investment decisions. It created a formal escalation process for concerns involving partner evaluation. It required Meridian to publish a yearly review of strategic decision standards. The $500 million investment moved forward. But the company that received the money was not exactly the same company that had requested it. There was a cost. The expansion timeline moved back 4 months. Several projects had to be rescheduled. Employees worried about uncertainty. Some investors questioned why Meridian had allowed the process to become public. Marcus understood all of it. Real accountability was rarely convenient. It cost time. It cost reputation. Sometimes it cost relationships. That evening, Marcus visited the manufacturing facility in Ohio, the same place he had walked through months earlier before the handshake. The factory floor was loud. Machines moved. Workers checked measurements. Orders were being prepared. A supervisor named Carla Reynolds approached him. "I heard the investment is moving forward." He smiled. "It is." She nodded. "Good." Then she looked around. People here were worried. Marcus understood. The dispute had happened in executive rooms, but the consequences belonged to ordinary employees. "The company has work to do," Marcus said. Carla nodded. "Most companies do." That answer stayed with him, because she was right. The goal was not finding a perfect organization. The goal was building one that could admit when it was wrong and still choose to improve. Before Marcus left the facility, Carla handed him something. A small metal identification tag from an old machine that had been replaced during the expansion planning. "Why give me this?" she smiled. "Because people usually remember the big things." She held up the worn piece of metal. "But the small things are what tell you whether something was really built." Marcus kept the tag. Months earlier, a handshake had been refused. Now the partnership was real, but the victory was not that Marcus finally earned a place at the table. He had already earned it. The victory was that the table itself had been forced to change. Part 9, Repair Under Pressure. 6 months after the original handshake was refused, Marcus Ellison returned to Meridian Biosystems. The building looked exactly the same. The glass walls, the polished floors, the quiet movement of executives carrying folders between meetings. From the outside, nothing had changed. But Marcus knew better. Organizations rarely changed in the places people could photograph. They changed in the procedures nobody saw, the questions people were allowed to ask, the concerns people were required to document, the decisions that could no longer be made in private. The independent governance assessment had been completed 2 weeks earlier. Its findings were released to employees first, not investors, not the media, employees. That decision had come from the audit committee after Marcus raised one concern during negotiations. If the people affected by the culture are the last ones informed about the culture changing, then the change is only a message. The board listened, and this time they acted. The report did not use dramatic language. It did not describe Meridian as a dishonest company. It did not describe every executive as responsible for the failures. Instead, it identified specific behaviors, unclear evaluation standards, the informal decision-making channels, leadership assumptions that were treated as operational concerns, and a culture where some employees felt safer questioning numbers than questioning people. That final point stayed with Elena Park. She read the report alone in her office. Not because she disagreed, because she recognized herself in it. For years, she had believed that speaking carefully was the same as speaking safely. She had learned to choose words that could survive executive meetings, concern instead of problem, opportunity instead of failure, misalignment instead of unfair treatment. The report forced her to confront something uncomfortable. Sometimes careful language protected the organization more than the people inside it. A month earlier, Elena had accepted a new role. Not at Meridian. She had been offered a position leading operational integrity at another manufacturing company. At first, she thought leaving meant she had failed. But Marcus had told her something before she made the decision. "You leaving does not mean the company won." Elena had looked at him. "What does it mean?" "It means you decided where your experience could create the most value." She remembered that conversation as she packed the last box from her Meridian office. Not every ending was a punishment. Some were choices. Across the country, the consequences of the Meridian Review continued. Richard Whitmore remained CEO, but his leadership structure changed. The board required quarterly accountability reviews. Major strategic partnerships required documented criteria before approval. Executive recommendations needed written justification. And the phrase that started everything, executive compatibility, was removed from Meridian's evaluation framework. It was replaced with measurable standards, operational experience, strategic alignment, risk management, performance history, things that could be evaluated, things that could be challenged, things that did not depend on whether someone looked familiar. But the most difficult repair happened somewhere else, with the people who had remained silent. During a company-wide meeting, a senior executive named Thomas Reed spoke. He had been present during the original investment discussions. He had not created the problem. He had noticed parts of it, and he had said nothing. "I believed staying neutral was the responsible choice," Thomas told employees. The room remained quiet, but neutrality was not neutral when one side had more power than the other. It was not a perfect apology. Marcus respected that. Perfect apologies were often performances. Real accountability usually sounded less polished. That evening, Marcus returned to the Ohio facility. Expansion project had begun. The first construction phase was underway. The old machine areas were being redesigned. New equipment had arrived. The factory was louder than before. More active, more uncertain, more alive. Carla Reynolds, the supervisor who had given him the metal identification tag months earlier, walked beside him. "You kept it?" Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. The old metal tag was still there. "I did," she smiled. "Why?" Marcus looked at the worn surface. "Because it reminded me that the smallest parts of a system still matter." Carla nodded. "That's usually where people stop looking." They stood near the new production line. Marcus watched employees preparing for the next phase of the expansion. Some knew his name, some did not, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The investment had never been about making him the center of the story. It was about making sure the people connected to the decision had a fair process. Later that night, Marcus received a message from Daniel. A new report had been filed, not about Meridian, about another company that had recently contacted Northbridge. Even wanted to discuss it. Marcus looked at the message but did not open the attachment immediately. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a quiet moment before responding. The Meridian conflict was over. The deal was moving forward. The process had changed. The people responsible had faced consequences. The wound was not erased, but it was no longer ignored. Marcus placed the phone on the table. Tomorrow he would read the report. Tomorrow he would decide what came next. But tonight he sat with the knowledge that sometimes justice was not a door closing on the person who caused harm. Sometimes it was a door opening for the people who came after. Part 10. The Last Consequence and Open Horizon. 9 months after Marcus Ellison first extended his hand across the Meridian conference table, he returned to the same room. The room had not changed much. The same glass walls, the same city view, the same long walnut table where decisions worth hundreds of millions were made by people who often believed they were only discussing numbers. But one thing was different: the seating arrangement. For the first time, Marcus noticed that nobody had placed him according to status. There was no investor side, no executive side, no separation between the people making decisions and the people affected by them. Everyone sat around the same table. The final Bruns report was being presented, and this time, the process was not about defending Meridian. It was about measuring whether the company had actually changed. Samuel Grant opened the meeting. "The purpose of this review is not to revisit blame." He looked around the room. "The purpose is to determine whether the corrective actions produced measurable improvement." The report was clear. Meridian had completed the independent evaluation framework. All strategic partnerships now required documented criteria before selection. Subjective leadership assessments could no longer be added after a recommendation without approval and justification. Employees had a protected channel to report concerns about decision-making practices. Executive reviews included accountability for how decisions were reached, not only the results. The $500 million investment had moved forward. The manufacturing expansion had begun. The first phase had created new operational positions and reopened partnerships with regional suppliers. But the report also acknowledged something that mattered. The company had not fixed everything. Culture did not change because a report was published. Trust did not return because a policy was written. Those things had to be rebuilt through repeated decisions. Marcus appreciated that honesty. A perfect ending would have been easier. It also would have been less true. After the meeting, Richard Whitmore approached him. For months, their interactions had been defined by documents, reviews, and careful statements. Now they stood in the hallway without anyone watching. "I wanted to tell you something," Richard said. Marcus waited. "Eddie, when I first met you, I thought I was evaluating whether you were the right person for Meridian." He paused. "I never considered that you were evaluating whether Meridian was the right company to partner with." Marcus looked at him. "That is usually the part people forget." Richard nodded. "I know. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no perfect friendship. Some relationships could be repaired. Others could only become respectful. That was enough." "I should have asked better questions," Richard said. Marcus accepted the statement, not because it erased what happened. Because accountability was supposed to change future behavior, not rewrite the past. Later that afternoon, Marcus visited the Ohio facility one more time. The expansion was moving. New equipment stood where the old machinery had been. Workers moved through the updated production area. The sound was different, not quieter, more organized. Carla Reynolds found him near the entrance. "You always come back here." Marcus smiled. "I like seeing where decisions end up." She looked around. "Most executives only want to see the finished picture. I'm more interested in what it takes to build it." Carla nodded. Then she noticed the old metal identification tag still attached to Marcus's key ring. "You really kept that thing?" Marcus looked at it. Months earlier, it had been a reminder. A reminder that systems were built from small pieces. Now it meant something different. "It reminds me that the parts people ignore are usually the parts that decide whether something works." Carla smiled. "That sounds like something you'd put in a speech." Marcus laughed. "I probably wouldn't." And that was the moment he realized how much had changed. Not because he had won, not because Meridian had lost. Because the story no longer needed a villain standing at the center of it. The damage had been real, the consequences had been real, the repair had been real. That evening, Marcus finally opened Daniel's message from months earlier. The report he had ignored while focusing on Meridian. It was from another company, another investment review, another situation where someone had raised concerns about whether a qualified partner was the right image for the organization. Marcus read the first page, then the second. The details were different. The industry was different. The people were different. But the question underneath was familiar. Not whether the person could do the work, whether people were comfortable seeing them with the opportunity. Marcus closed the document. He did not call anyone immediately. He did not make a dramatic announcement. He simply saved the file into a new folder. The folder was titled "Processes Worth Examining," because he had learned something important. A handshake could be refused in 3 seconds. A decision could be influenced in a few sentences. A system could be changed only through patience, evidence, and people willing to stay when leaving would be easier. The Meridian deal was no longer a frozen negotiation. It was a completed partnership. The company had grown. The process had changed. The people involved had been forced to look more closely at how they measured value. And Marcus Ellison was still doing what he had always done. Walking into rooms where decisions were made. Not because he needed permission to belong. Because the decisions made in those rooms affected people who deserved better ones. Before he left his office that night, Marcus looked at the new report waiting on his screen. A different company. A different challenge. A different set of people asking whether change was possible. This time, he knew the first question was not whether the problem could be solved. The first question was whether the people inside the system were willing to see it.